Good morning. My name is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. I want to say thank you so much for joining me this morning. We have a lot to talk about. If you've been following us, you know that we are focusing on nonprofit ethics for the month of June. And we've already gone over what ethics are. We talked about social responsibility. And today we're going to be talking about best practices for board governance. And if you tune in tomorrow, we will actually show you how to develop a code of ethics. All right. And then other live streams, we're going to be talking on Thursday about ethics in nonprofit fundraising. And then next week, we will continue our conversation about ethics. We'll even be talking about politics and how you can steer clear of the IRS trouble. All right. So today we're going to be focusing on best practices for board governance. And without further ado, I am going to share my screen and we'll just get right into it. And if you're joining us today, please take the time to say hello and let us know where you're from. If you have any experience with ethics as it relates to the board and some of your best practices, it would be great if you can share some of those and we can talk about it. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to post and we can engage that way. All right, so today we're going to be talking about best practices for board governance. And when we're talking about board governance, that's just a very fancy way of saying, these are board operations. This is the way we manage the organization, so to speak. All right. And when we talk about ethics, if you recall, ethics refer to the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity, and the same is true for our nonprofit organizations. All right. And today, we are going to focus on what the IRS believes. We often think about the IRS when it comes to compliance. We think about the enforcement arm, right? But the IRS, believe it or not, really, really wants to see nonprofits succeed. So I thought it would be really good to do a presentation from the IRS perspective, because if you can get your board governance right from the IRS perspective, then believe you me, it's going to pass muster with the foundation and other funders, with the federal government, when you go and apply for funds, state government and local government. All right. So again, the IRS standard is the gold star or the blue ribbon standard. All right, so let's talk about what the IRS believes. The IRS believes that a well governed charity is more likely to obey tax laws, safeguard charitable assets, and serve charitable interests than one with poor or lax governance. Again, so when we look at governance and when we look at ethics, we're looking at a whole system. Our code of ethics is basically our rules, right? And some of our policies and our practices, right? So if you include in your policies and practices those things that are approved by the IRS, those things that the IRS encourages, you are in really, really good shape. All right, so a charity that has clearly articulated purposes that describe its mission, a knowledgeable and committed governing body and management team, and sound management practices is more likely to operate effectively and consistent with tax law requirements. So obviously the IRS is concerned about how we comply with the tax law, because remember, when we get our 501c3s, it is through the tax code. 501c3 is a section of the tax code, and everything we do from the point of applying for tax exempt status to now, managing your ongoing nonprofit is reviewed by the IRS on an annual basis, and they do that through Form 990. All right, so you might ask, how do best practices tie in with ethics? So ethics or moral philosophy is a branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior, and that's from Wikipedia. So again, when we develop, our internal systems, that is our policies, our practices, and our codes of ethics, we want to make sure that those tie in, with our mission, vision, strategy, and all of that. But we also too want to make sure that there's alignment with what the IRS is going to be reviewing. So again, as I said before, the IRS is interested in more than just enforcement, slapping you on the wrist or even in some cases putting you in jail when things are not quite right. They really do want to make sure that they give you the tools that you need in order to manage your organization more effectively. And if you want to learn more, I encourage you to spend some time on the irs.gov website. Look at the tools that they have, look at the information that they have to share, look at the videos and all of that good stuff. But the IRS, along with any other organization that is really serious about being good stewards, is going to consistently review their mission and make changes as need be. And the things that constitute a need to make change to your mission would really be driven by what's going on in the community, what's going on internally, right? So you always want to serve the community within the parameters of your own organization's abilities and capabilities. All right, so it starts off with our organizing documents. And when we talk about organizing documents, those are those very first documents that we develop when we start our organizations. And that varies from state to state. Different states have different rules and regulations, but what the IRS requires is to look at your articles of incorporation, and that is required by every state. And they also want to look at your bylaws, right? They want to look at the bylaws to make sure that your articles and bylaws are consistent with state code. They want to make sure that they're consistent with your own mission. And if they see any discrepancies between, what you write in your articles of incorporation and what you write in your bylaws and what it is you're doing, the activities that you're engaged in, they will let you know, right? So when you file Form 990, there's going to be areas, there'll be certain questions that you're going to need to answer, and that will help the IRS know if, in fact, there is some mission creep on your part, and it will also let them know if there are other things that are out of whack. And, if they're out of whack, they will give you a call. Or rather, shall I say, write a letter. And the governing body, that's your board of directors, board of trustees. And as a board, you have a fiduciary responsibility and you are legally responsible for everything that goes on in the organization. And one of the most important duties that you have is a duty of care. That means that every matter that comes before the board has to be weighed carefully. You need to look at the pros and cons. If you are looking at contracts and looking to, I guess, select a vendor, you should have policies and practices in place around contracting that mitigates conflict of interest, that helps you decide objectively who gets the business, right? If you are deciding on the fate of an employee, you should look at pros and cons, different alternatives, So basically what duty of care means is that everything that you do, you're going to look at pros and cons and look at it at all angles. You're not going to be a rubber stamp for the board president or the executive director. And also, you should remember that governing board should be diverse in terms of skill sets. You want to make sure that people understand their roles and responsibilities, but you also want to make sure that they're informed of what's going on and that they do have the skills in order to keep the organization afloat. Skills like finance, skills like marketing, skills like understanding uh, how to do, fundraising, skills like how to do programs, and all of that stuff. And another ethical responsibility is that of transparency, right? So when you start a nonprofit organization, you are granted, if you go through the process, tax exempt status. In return for that tax exempt status, there is a certain expectation since you are not paying taxes, you are existing for the public trust to make a positive impact on the community. And even though you're not paying taxes, it doesn't mean that you're not required to disclose your activities. So you need to disclose your financial activities as well as your programmatic activities, who's on your board, and all of that good stuff, right? And we know from experience, or even not from experience, even from just listening to the news occasionally, we hear stories about how organizations operating in the dark, and you know those stories about what goes on in the dark come to the light. If people are operating in secrecy, there's a good chance that they have something to hide, right? So at a very minimum, you're going to be required to complete a Form 990 and file it. So that gives some indication of what's going on. But even still, there are organizations that do the Form 990, but they don't believe in sharing information, right, about what it is that they're doing, even though they're existing at the, at the benevolence of you, the public, who pays taxes, right? So we see that if a governing board tolerates a climate of secrecy or neglect, the IRS is concerned that charitable assets are more likely to be diverted to benefit the private interests of insiders at the expense of public and charitable interests. And time again, you read any scandal about a nonprofit, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be some secret backroom deals that, sometimes only one or two people knew about. I can tell you of a situation in my own community where a nonprofit organization had an executive director who had, I believe, 7 signers on their checkbook. And he had a situation where he would not let the left hand or the right hand or the third hand or the fourth hand or whatever. He wouldn't let people know what's going on. One transaction will be between him and one of the other signatories. Another transaction will be between him and yet another signatory. And it finally caught up with them. And city government came in and did an audit and read them the Riot Act. They were a heartbeat away from being charged with fraud. Had they not restored the funds that they misappropriated, people, including the board members, would have, been subject to prison. All right, so your successful governing boards include people who are not only knowledgeable, but they're engaged, and they're also selected with the organization's needs in mind, right? So as you select board members, think about the skills that are going to be really important for you to carry out your mission within the context of, what the organization needs, within the context of what is going on in the community, and most importantly, what your clients need. All right, so those are things like accounting, finance, um, compensation. So it might be good for you to have an HR person on your board, somebody like an attorney who really understands ethics, because attorneys have to study ethics before they even pass the bar. All right. And when we look at board size, we know legally at a very minimum, you need three incorporators, so that in the event you go ahead and apply for tax exempt status, you have at least one person who eventually can become the secretary, another person who can be the treasurer, another person who can become the president. But Beyond that, you need to look at what it is your organization, what activities your organization is engaged in, right? And you need to be able to have a board that's large enough to handle all the work that needs to be done, right? And when we talk about the work, we're talking about board work. We're not talking about employee work. So, you need to understand that a board has to be engaged in terms of finances. They need to oversee programs. They need to make sure that they're the face in the community for the organization, right? So they need to hire and fire people. So you need various committees that are going to do that work. It can't be, the same two or three people on every committee because that can be very, very tiring. So you want to have a board that's large enough to do all of that work, but not so large that it becomes unwieldy and very hard for you to communicate, keep up with people, and get work done. You also need to make sure that there are policies in place that reinforce the importance of having independent board members. Again, you don't want to have conflicts of interest where people have divided loyalty between a person or a business that is represented on the board, right, and the best interest of that organization. You don't want to have a board that's controlled by family members unless your foundation is a family foundation. Other than that, you want to make sure that people are not torn between, family and the organization, torn between a business that they might have a part in with some other board member in the organization. So you want to hire people who don't have conflicts of interest. And you should know too that the Form 990 is going to ask questions that get to, whether or not you have a conflict of interest policy in place and how those policies are enforced. All right, and then you want to make sure that you standardize those policies and procedures throughout the organization, especially if you have more than one site. So it needs to go throughout the organization at a certain location, but if you have several locations, everybody at different locations needs to be on the same page as it relates to your policies and procedures and your code of ethics. And, Form 990 is going to ask you questions to help them understand, help them. And when I say them, that's going to be the IRS. They're going to want to understand how you're implementing your policies and procedures as it relates to ethics and conflicts of interest. All right. And the next thing is, the governance and management policy. So you got board policies that, determine how the board is going to operate. And then you've got the management policies, which are informed by what's happening with the board, right? So the management policies are those policies that govern programs in our day-to-day operations, right? So although the IRS doesn't require charities to have governance and management policies, they're keenly interested, right? So they're going to review an organization's application for tax exempt status, right? So that's your Form 1022. And then they're going to also examine your Form 990 that you present on an annual basis to make sure that the organization has implemented policies relating to executive compensation, which is a biggie, conflicts of interest, investments, fundraising, documenting governance decisions, so your minutes, document retention and destruction, and whistleblower claims. So we're going to go into each one of those a little bit deeper. All right, so as it relates to executive compensation, the IRS, as well as any of your donors, anybody who gives you money, is really concerned about how much money is paid in salaries versus how much money is going to actually complete the mission, right? So you can't pay more than reasonable compensation. That is an IRS rule. And although the IRS doesn't require that you follow a particular process, they do have ways of determining whether or not you are paying too much for your executives, right? There is disclosure on Form 990. So they're looking at compensation of officers, directors, trustees, key employees. Again, there's a space for you to um, list how much time they spend on activities for the organization and how much money they're getting in return. And you, as a member of the public, can go to Form 990 and review that about any charity that you're interested in. All right. So they also want to make sure, too, that there's a practice in place where there is an objective review of salaries and how the decisions are made as to what the compensation is. And then they want to make sure that the people who are making the decision have no conflicts of interest. They're not going to benefit somehow through the back door from the decisions that they make. All right. So, what are some of the disclosures that they need to make regarding executive compensation? So, on Form 990 and even the Form 1023, when you are, first starting out, they're going to ask you questions as it relates to executive compensation, right? So the Form 990, which is your annual return, it asks whether the process used to determine the compensation of an organization's top management official, right, and other key officers include a review and approval by independent persons, comparability data, and contemporaneous substantiation of the deliberation and decision. Okay, so let's break that down, see what all of that means. So when we talk about a review and approval by independent persons, those would be people who don't have a vested interest in the outcome of the decision. They can be objective because whatever the decision is, it's not going to impact them financially, right? It's not going to impact them politically. It's not going to impact um, how far they can go in their career. So these are totally independent people. When they talk about comparability data, they're looking at, whether or not the board has actually compared, compensation of their top level executives to other people holding the same job, for a similar organization, similar size organization in the same community, same state, right? And you need to be able to prove that there was some deliberation about this compensation, right? So that needs to be documented. It needs to be documented in the minutes. You need to have documented proof that you have done the research of what these particular salary levels should be for a similar organization, right, in your community. So that's what they mean, contemporaneous substantiation. So that means at the same time, it's current, right? It's not like it's lagging, right? And they want to make sure that that deliberation process, your decision making process. So you need to have some system in place. You need to where you're documenting how the decisions were made, how the votes went, and that needs to be part of the backup. And the vote itself needs to be recorded in your minutes. All right. So Form 990 also requires compensation information for certain officers, directors, trustees, and key employees, and the highest level compensated employees be disclosed. And they also want to know about that information for your contractors. Contractors meaning people that are not paid employees, but they're on contract doing work for you. So they're going to want to understand those relationships and that compensation as well. So there's a thing called the rebuttable presumption test. The IRS is going to look at the salaries and make sure that they don't seem, too high. Because remember, when the IRS looks at your Form 990, they're going to be looking at things like administrative costs, how much money you spend for administration, and usually your executive director's salary, part of it is covered in administration. They're going to be looking at how much money you spend in fundraising, how much money goes to direct programming, and they want to make sure the vast majority of that money, say around 80% and even more, right, goes to direct programming and making an impact. So they're going to be looking very closely not only at the distribution of the way the money has been spent, right? They're going to be zeroing in on the executive compensation to make sure that people haven't been in the business of starting nonprofits just to enrich themselves, right? So there's going to be this rebuttable presumption test, and the IRS presumes, right? They presume that any compensation that you give is fair, right? And they're also going to look for evidence, right, that it's been approved in advance by an authorized body comprised entirely of individuals who don't have a conflict of interest. They're also going to look for proof that the authorized body obtained as well as relied upon appropriate data so that they could, make sure that the salaries are in line with what the market will bear and what a similar organization that's doing similar things as yours in your community would pay. And then they're also going to be looking for whether or not the authorized body adequately documented the basis for its determination concurrently. So at the same time as making the determination, they don't want you to rely on old data, right? And at the same time, they don't want you to make a decision and then go and back into it, right? And justify it. They want to be sure that all of this is going on at the same time. All right. And as I mentioned before, the IRS is keenly, keenly interested in executive compensation. It's a focal point in their examination program. So that means that anytime the IRS is zeroing in on any organization, one of the first things they're going to look at is how much they pay the key executive and key leadership team. Because, 9 times out of 10, when there's fraud and greed involved, the people who are in leadership have also enriched themselves through salaries, right? So again, they'll be asking you questions on your Form 990 that will help you or help them to understand how the decisions were made in terms of how much you're going to pay the top executive team. And then they're also going to look and see what measures you've taken and make sure that your whole process has been documented. And documented, through a vote, in your minutes, documented through, a process and, through policies and procedures that will be referred to as you make your vote. All right. Another duty, another one of the main duties that board members have is a duty of loyalty to the organization. And when we talk about loyalty to the organization, that means when you're on that organization's business, right, there should be no conflict of interest between what's best for that organization that you're working with and some other organization that you might be serving or some other business that you might own or have a relationship with, some other family member, right? So you want to make sure that when you're focusing on that organization, you're there for that organization only. All right. So you have to act in the best interest of the organization. And you need to also make sure that you have a conflict of interest policy in place and enforce that conflict of interest policy. All right. So the IRS encourages, and it's interesting that they use the word encourage and encourage, and just try not doing it and see how much encouragement you'll get, right? So they encourage a charity's board of directors to adopt and regularly evaluate a written conflict of interest policy that requires directors and staff to act solely in the interests of the charity without regard for personal interests or interests of other um, people or organizations that might do business with the organization or some organization that you're doing business with, and even your own business. You also have to include written procedures for determining whether or not a relationship, financial interest, or business affiliation results in a conflict of interest. There needs to be some disclosure, and your policy should also prescribe a course of action in the event that a conflict of interest is identified. And this is something that needs to be reviewed constantly. And you need to also refer to conflicts of interest policies, I would say almost every board meeting, whenever votes are taken, just to make sure that there are no conflicts driving, the decision. You also need policies as they relate to investments. You know, Especially now, organizations are much more focused on being more aggressive with their investments. They might um, take extra money and invest in more aggressive stocks. They might be part of a joint venture or even create a social venture, right, of their own. And that in and of itself creates a certain set of risks. So you need to make sure that there are policies in place that guide your investment decisions, right? That outlines what types of investments you can get involved in, the level of risk, right? It also would have policies and procedures as to how you go about hiring professionals who will help you manage those investments, right? So all of that needs to be written down. It needs to be documented in a vote, vote of approval. And you need to refer to those policies, whenever there are any decisions that relate to any investments. You need to have a separate policy that talks about the compensation for your investment advisors, and also to make sure there's no conflict of interest between the investment advisors and people on your board and your organization. So the IRS is going to ask you questions on the Form 990 that help them understand how you came to decide who's going to be your investment advisor, but they're also going to be looking to see if there's evidence of some conflict of interest. And the same is true for fundraising. You need to make sure that there are fundraising policies and procedures in place that have been adopted by the board. You need to make sure that the board is actually adhering to those policies and procedures. So the IRS wants to make sure that you have policy that ensure that fundraising solicitations meet federal as well as state law requirements. So, as we think about some of the state law requirements, especially for the folks in the state of Illinois, with the state of Illinois, you have to make sure that you are reporting every year to our state. You have to be in good standing with our Secretary of State as well as our Attorney General's office. So you got to make sure that those disclosures are current. And you got to make sure that those disclosures are accurate, truthful, and candid. And then you also need to make sure that your fundraising costs are in alignment with best practices. Now, there's arguments back and forth, especially now, as to whether or not 10 to 15% is reasonable. That's the standard. But there are people who are pushing the envelope and saying that fundraising costs, pretty much like sales and marketing costs for a for-profit business. If you limit yourself to 10 to 15%, you're not going to be as effective as you could be if you invest more. However, if you invest more than 10 or 15%, that might be perceived as a red flag by the IRS as well as your funders. So you have to be very, very careful about your fundraising expenses. So there need to be policies and procedures that are approved by the board and adhered to by the board and staff, right? And then there are questions in Form 990 that will get at how you determine what your fundraising policies are and whether or not you follow them. And then the meeting minutes. Now, let's be clear. Your Form 990, which is your information return that you have to file every year, by law, you have to disclose Form 990 publicly, right? So if anybody asks for your Form 990, you're obligated to give them your last 3 years of 990s. Your meeting minutes are, you don't by law have to disclose them, but the IRS strongly encourages you to disclose them for inspection so people can come on your premises and look at your meeting minutes. And there are some funders, especially when you're looking at large sums of money for, say, example, a construction project, some large grant from the federal government, they're going to look at your minutes to make sure that, the decisions that were made, they want to understand how the decisions were made. They want to know if it was a deliberative process where people engaged in some sort of discussion before before the vote was held, right? And they want to make sure that those votes were made, in accordance also with your bylaws. So they might even look at your meeting minutes as well as ask for your bylaws to make sure that what you're doing is consistent with your bylaws and is consistent with your mission. All right. So even though they're not going to ask for your meeting minutes with the Form 990, they're going to be asking questions to ask whether or not the organization contemporaneously documents meetings. So that means at the same time the meeting is going on, there's somebody writing what's going on, or written actions undertaken during the year by its governing body and each committee. So not only do you have to have meeting minutes for the full board, every committee, every standing committee, every ad hoc committee of the board needs to have minutes to document the decisions that were made and how those decisions came to be. And you should also know too that any decisions that are made in committee, need to be brought forth to the board and ratified by the full board. All right, another important piece is document retention, and those policies determine how long you should keep your documents. If you are a member of the nonprofit Utopia community, I can share, a document retention policy with you. Just you can be on the lookout in our community for that post. And the policy should cover things like backup procedures, what happens in the event of an emergency. So your document retention policies are going to be very closely aligned to your business interruption policies, right? Your document retention policy is also going to have policies for archiving documents and then regular checkups to make sure that the system stays reliable. And again, charities are required by the IRS to keep books and records that are relevant to its tax exemption and its filings with the IRS. So that means your initial Form 1023, your initial application, you need to keep that application for tax exempt status on record forever. As long as your organization is in operation, you need to have that Form 1023, and that needs to be available for, public inspection. So you need to also have policies as it relates to financial data, policies as it relates to personnel data, policies as it relates to program documents, and again, how you're going to archive those data, how you're going to handle confidential information. And Form 990 is going to ask you questions that help them better understand how you retain your documents. All right, so you also need to have a code of ethics. So remember, we talked about ethics being, at a very base level, a difference, understanding the difference of right and wrong. And the code of ethics is, creating a set of policies and procedures that give you, the parameters within which you can consider good behavior or positive behavior, right? And it also talks about what is considered bad behavior as well as some of the consequences. So those codes of ethics should be very, very closely aligned with your core values. And you should not only write down what your core values are, you need to refer to those core values in every decision that you made. Those core values shouldn't be sitting up on a shelf, just because they look pretty and all that good stuff and they sound good, right? All too often, organizations say what they believe and they act out what they really believe. And you really want to make sure that your code of ethics, your core values are in sync and they support your mission and vision, right? So because you have tax exempt status, right, meaning you don't pay any taxes, you are expected to hold a public trust, right? So nonprofits are held to a higher standard than even our corporations, and our corporations are already held to a high standard. They're expected to behave ethically. But you, as an organization that's mission driven, you exist for the public good, you hold a public trust, you're going to be held to a higher standard. So your board ultimately is going to be responsible for enforcing this code of ethics. You're legally going to be responsible for everything, every liability that the organization has. So it's in your best interest as you govern the organization to make sure that there is a code of ethics and that that code of ethics is reviewed and followed. All right. So you want to make sure that um, those are followed, and a code of ethics is going to furthermore communicate, to employees, to funders, to people in the community, what you believe, what you stand for. The IRS is also looking to be sure that you have whistleblower policies in place. And if you have any public money, 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to be asking you for a copy of your whistleblower policy. And whistleblower policies were basically put in place to protect employees. If they see something, they can feel free to report it internally without fear of retaliation. All right. So Form 990 is going to see if in fact you have such a policy. And if you're a member of the nonprofit Utopia community, I can share a policy with you. Okay. As members of boards, it's on you to make sure that there's sound stewardship of all the resources, the financial resources, particularly, but every asset of the organization. When it comes to financial management, there should be a finance committee as well as the full board reviewing the financial documents, right? So you want to make sure that you're spending money in ways that help you meet your mission. All right. And you also want to make sure that those funds are appropriately accounted for. And you want to keep your financial statements up to date. So the types of financial reports you're going to be required to have are your balance sheet, and in nonprofit language, that's your statement of financial position. And you also need an income statement, and in nonprofit language, that's your statement of activities. Your balance sheet is going to give a snapshot of the um, financial organization's health, on any given, on that particular day, on the date that it was prepared. So it will list things like your current assets. That'll be things like cash, um, mutual funds, anything that's relatively liquid. It will also include hard assets, right? It will include your liabilities, right? So the things like any bills that are coming due currently, any long-term obligations that you might have to pay, right? It'll show investments, right? Those types of things. You'll have a cash flow statement, which shows, the investing activities of an organization, shows how much cash you have on hand. You'll have bank reconciliations, which will reconcile the balance that you're showing on your books that given day with what's on the bank statement, and that should be done on a monthly basis. And then at the end of the year, you do your statement of functional expenses. Now, the board is not necessarily going to review your bank reconciliations, but the board should want to know that a bank reconciliation has been done, and when they looked at the cash flow statement, that a reconciliation has been done, and the cash flow statement reflects that reconciliation between the bank statement and what you have on hand, internally. And then your statement of functional expenses, again, that's done at the end of the year. And what that shows is how your funds were spent, how much money was spent on fundraising, how much money was spent on administrative costs, and how much money was spent on day-to-day, program activities. So there needs to be policies and procedures around financial management, right? And it should also include, what statements and reports you're going to file. So your policies and procedures are going to go beyond these statements. They'll talk about how you prepare these statements. It'll talk about the separation of duties and how you input financial controls such that no one person is doing all of the financial management in the dark, and then you have to find out the hard way that they've been skimming money. So all of that needs to be monitored by the board. And separately from your finance committee, which is going to review finances on a day-to-day basis, you might consider creating a separate audit committee. And this audit committee is going to work with the auditor to make sure that an audit is completed. And you should remember too, an audit is not necessarily put in place to detect fraud, although if fraud is detected, the auditor is required to report it. They're basically looking to make sure that your policies and procedures conform to generally accepted accounting principles. They're also looking to make sure that you have strong financial controls. If in fact they find problems with your financial controls, it's their duty to report that to the board in the form of a letter. And it's the board's responsibility to read what those recommendations are for improvement and develop a plan to make sure that they can improve what the audit found to be missing or found to be wrong. All right. And remember, in your Form 990, they're going to be asking questions to help understand, when I say they, I'm talking about the IRS is going to be asking questions to understand how your audit process works. And if you're receiving large sums of money, right, they will do a single audit. They meaning the federal government will do a single audit of that particular grant to make sure those funds are accounted for. All right, so if you have any questions, please feel free to post. My contact information is here, Valerie F. Leonard at nonprofitutopia.com. If you're a member of the Nonprofit Utopia community, we can continue this conversation in, you know, in the Nonprofit Utopia community. If you want to set up office hours, I am open to set up an hour where we can talk one-on-one about some of the ethical issues of your organization. And when I say ethical issues, that's not to cast aspersion around your organization. Every organization needs to have a code of ethics so that they can prevent ethical lapses. And in fact, we're going to also do a live stream next week to talk about how you can recover from bad press that comes about as a result of ethical lapses. All right. So I'm going to check right now and see if there are any questions. And again, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for joining. All right, so it does not look like we have any questions or comments. I want to say thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure. If you want to review the recording, feel free to go to our YouTube page. You can go to my personal LinkedIn page, or you could go to the Nonprofit Utopia Facebook page as well. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to end this broadcast. If you are a member of the Nonprofit Utopia community, I do have handouts that you can look at so that you can begin to implement some of these policies and procedures at home. If you tune in tomorrow, we're going to have a guest on who will talk about how we, step by step, how we can go ahead and implement these policies, how we can develop and implement these policies at home. All right, so without further ado, there being no questions, I want to say thank you again for joining us and take care. I hope to see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.